the most powerful tool within your content modeling toolbox is blocks. And blocks provide you with a mechanism to create a very flexible CMS. Now, when it comes to content modeling, block design is typically the bit that makes or breaks your project. And in this video, we're going to be going block crazy. So in this video, you're going to learn everything you need to know in order to be an Umbraco block master. And I'm going to cover properties, setup, tips, tricks and hacks, and basically everything you need to know to get going. So keep watching to unlock the power of efficient content modeling with blocks within Umbraco. The first step is to do the actual content modeling itself. So this means that we need to log into the CMS, and then once we're here, go to settings, and then within settings, we go to document types. And it's within here that you're going to create all your pages and blocks. Now on a new project, the first thing I do is click on these ellipses, create a new folder, and as you can see here, I create a folder for blocks and a folder for pages. So this just gives you some nice separation to find things. Now, content modeling for pages and blocks is pretty much exactly the same. Again, click on these ellipses, and you can see here we have these two options. So we can either create a document type or an element type, and it doesn't really make a difference which one you pick. Now, in Umbraco jargon, an element type is a block. So clicking on this element type is going to save you one less click. However, I'll show you how to create a block using this document type option. So we'll click on this. We're then going to go over to permissions. We're going to scroll down. You can see here we've got is an element type. So clicking on this makes it a block. And if I just call this my block, this is all we need to do to create the outline of our content modeling process. Now, when it comes to adding properties to your block, we'll go to this design tab right here. You'll click on add group, and then within here, give your group a name. So like content. And then from here, we can add properties. Now, in order to add a property, click on select editor. And then from this select editor, you are free to use any of the out of the box Umbraco properties here. Now, one quick content modeling tip that I want to share here is around nesting. Now, when you're content modeling inside of Umbraco, it's possible to create a template that has an area where you can add a block, and the block you add has an area where you can add in another block, and the block you add in there has an area where you add in another block. And then this can carry on and carry on and carry on indefinitely. Now, in terms of good content modeling practices, you want to keep your nesting depth to maybe 1 or 2 levels. And typically, if you find yourself going to 3 or 4 levels, then it's going to be a painful experience for the content editors. Now, if you do find yourself going to 3 or 4 levels of nesting, then what you probably want to do is take a step back, look at your content modeling design, think about how you split up your page design, and basically refactor it. And trust me, I've been doing this for 20 years. You can always refactor your design somehow so it goes to 2 levels of nesting depth. So keeping that principle in mind quickly, when it comes to actually adding properties onto your block, the good news is that you can add every single out of the box Umbraco property onto any block. So out of the box, Umbraco has about 25 different properties. This includes things like the rich text area. We've got the ability to add in the block grid. We can add in block lists. Now, obviously, not having any limitations when you're content modeling your blocks is brilliant, but to stress, you should keep in mind this nesting problem because this could bite you in the bum later on. Now that you understand how to create blocks in Umbraco, the next step is to think about how we're going to allow content editors to be able to use those blocks to create pages. Now, the first technique we're going to look at is brand new to Umbraco v13, and this is adding blocks inside of the rich text area component. So if I click on the homepage here, you can see that we've got the rich text editor, RTE, and then in here, if I click on this little button here, you can see that I can pick from a block. Now, in this particular demo instance, I've only created a single block, so I can add this onto the page. And this block's got a single text string property, so I can add some content in here. And now I can simply add in some content. I can do the typical Microsoft Word text editing stuff. I can add in another block here if I want to. And you can see that this is a very simple way to allow editors to be able to add blocks onto pages. In a second, I'm going to show you how you can implement this within the CMS yourself, including hooking up all the views and everything you need to know there. But if I'm being 100% realsies with you right now, I wouldn't probably use this technique in my own projects. Now, if you go back through my website of 10 plus years, my YouTube channel, my books, I've never been a fan of allowing editors to be able to add macros, widgets, components, or blocks inside of text editors, regardless of which CMS that I pick. Now, the reason for this is because whenever I've done it, editors seem to mess things up much more easily, HTML gets destroyed, people get confused. And this is the reason why I typically favor a block approach only. Now, if that makes no sense to you, don't worry, I'm going to show you my preferred approach and how you can set it up shortly, but I thought it'd be worth pointing out that I probably wouldn't do this myself on my own projects. So with that said and done, I've jumped us over back to our document type builder, and on the home page here, if I click on it, you'll see that I've got a text editor. So just so you can see the process, I go to add property here. From here, you can see I've got select editor. From select editor, I go down and I select the rich text editor. Now, when I select the rich text editor, I can then pick this editor here. Now, if I click on the edit button, hopefully you can see that if I scrolly down here, I've got the options of changing what's in the toolbar. But the important one here is that we've got this available blocks. And this is new to V13 of Umbraco. So once I click this add button, and what will happen is that from the pop out here, anything that you've created within the CMS and set as an element type should be pickable. So you can see here, I've got this rich text block that I created earlier. Now, when it comes to adding a block into RTE, you can configure it by adding in certain metadata. So you can give it a label, you can display inline with text, you can add a custom view, you can associate a custom style sheet, we can set the content model, the settings model, we've got background colors, thumbnails, and we've also got the ability to hide it from the content editor. When a content editor comes to use the rich text editor in the CMS, they'll be able to pick from the block or the rich text block. So now that we've added our block onto our page, if I save and publish it, and then go to my website and try and view the page, you can see I'm getting a 500 error. Now, if I go back into the CMS, go to settings, then go to log viewer, you can see I've got an error being thrown. If I click on that error, we've got an unhandled exception has occurred. Views partial rich text components block CS.html does not have an available view. So remember this block.cshtml. So the first thing to explain here is why is Umbraco looking for a view called block.cshtml? Well, the answer to that is really simple. If I zoom out, go back to my document types and click on my block type that we're trying to render, if we look at the alias, which you'll find at the top here, you can see that the alias name is block. And this is something that you need to keep in mind, is that whenever you're trying to render element types in Umbraco, the file name of the view that you want to create will need to match this alias type. So for example, if I tried to render out this block here, I'd have to create a file which is called richtext.cshtml, and it's going to have to go in that rich text components folder. So if we now jump into Visual Studio, we can create this view. Now, before I do that, it's worth pointing out that this is my Umbraco V13 sample kit, and you can download this for free from my GitHub, and the link is in the description below. So according to the error, we need to create a folder inside of views. We need to create one inside of partials, and we need one which is called rich text. Now, currently this folder doesn't exist, so don't be surprised if you need to create this folder yourself. So it's called rich text. And then within here, we need to create a folder called components, I believe. So components. And then within here, we need to create a view. And the name of this view needs to be block, because this matches the block type alias. Now, for me personally, when it comes to setting up these views, I always think that the trickiest part is actually figuring out what data type that you need to pass into a view. So I'll quickly talk about this. So in order to set up this view, we need to do an inherits. Now, the first thing we need to do is use the Umbraco view page, and this is an Umbraco CMS web common views. Then, because we're working within the rich text block, we then need to use another core type, and this is Umbraco CMS core models blocks, and then rich text block item. And then this takes generics, and then the final thing we need to pass in is actually the block type that we're working with. So in this example, my block is in the Umbraco CMS web common publish models block, and this is using Umbraco's model builder. So just in case there's anyone out there and unsure about how to figure out what namespace and type you need to use, I'll quickly show you. So log into the CMS, go to settings. In settings, we've got models builder. Now click on models builder and click on this generate models button. Now the setup I'm using in my starter kit probably isn't the exact way that I'd set things up in production. And if you want to know how I'd set things up in production, then head over to my website. I've written all about it. The link's in below. So then after Umbraco's generated those models, if you look within your website project, if you go to the Umbraco folder, if you go to models, in this folder here, you're going to see a bunch of C# classes that have been automatically generated based on all of your document types. So this is going to contain pages and blocks. Now, the block that we want to work with in this example has got an alias of block. So all we need to do is click on this. And the type and namespace you need to pass into your view, you can find in here. So the namespace is this Umbraco CMS web common published models. And then the model you can see here is called block. And this is the reason why the thing that we pass into this rich text block item here is the Umbraco CMS web common publish models block. Now that we have that backing type set, you're free to add in whatever HTML you need. And because we're using that strongly typed C# class created by Umbraco, we can use strongly typed goodness in our views to reference our CMS content. Now, I would say that I'm not a big fan of this approach. Now, if we're using a proper MVC, then in a perfect world, we'll be passing in a view model here. And let's say that you need to do some specific code-based stuff. You might need to do additional logic around how you want to render out this property. Now, in this instance, you're probably going to have to start adding in some code within your views, which is not ideal. And for this reason, this is kind of why I prefer using the next technique that we're going to get to shortly. But with that said and done, this is a possibility for you. And then once we've got this all set up and run, if we go to our website, you should see that our view now gets rendered and everything's a-okay. The next way that we can render blocks on pages in Umbraco is the block list editor. And personally, this is the property that I use the most. We're now back inside Umbraco, and let's see how we can use this property in our content modeling. So I've got a page that I've called blocks example, and in order to add in the block list editor, click on add property, go to select editor, and then from here you can see we've got the block list editor within the lists view here. Now, when it comes to configuring this property, the first thing you can do is add the available blocks. So if I just remove this rich text, you can see that we can click on the add button, and then everything we set as an element type will be selectable as a block here, just like in the previous example. When we're adding in a block, we can give it a name, we can give it a custom view, custom style sheet. We don't need to worry about that too much. We can just submit it and save. And then we've got the ability to start adding in things like the required amount of blocks. So is there a minimum or maximum level? We can have things like live editing mode, inline editing mode. We can do things like customize the editor width inside Umbraco. Once you're happy with everything, click submit, off you go. Okay, so now if we go and try and view this block page, we'll get another 500 error. Going back to our logs, we'll see a brand new error here. If we look at our errors, click on unhandled exceptions, you're going to see here, if I zoom in, that the partial view this time needs to live in block list component block. So now we know where we need to create our partial. Let's go back to our solution, and then within views, within partials, within block list, you're going to have to create a folder called components, and then in it, create a view, and the document type alias needs to match the file name. Now the code you need to add in here for the backing type model is slightly different, and I don't really like this approach, but I'm going to show you how to improve it in a minute. So we do inherits. We're again coming from the Umbraco view page, but this time we're doing the Umbraco CMS core models blocks, and this is a block list item. Now the block list item doesn't take generics here. So in order to access our Umbraco model builder, instead we need to write some custom code within our view. I'm not a big fan of this, but you can see here I've got my Umbraco CMS web common publish models block, and then I can access the content doing model.content. This is then going to give us access to this strongly typed content property here, and I can use this property, this object, to then use my strongly typed goodness. With all the HTML created, the final question that we need to answer is actually how do we render that property in the first place? So I'll quickly switch over to our page template and I'll show you. In order to render out the property, you'll need to use this HTML helper, which is get block list HTML. So if you go over to umbraco.com and look at the documentation, this is the way that they recommend you implement this property. Now, for me personally, in terms of the code, I hate not being able to pass in the view model, and I hate having to put custom code in a view that I can't unit test. And it's for this reason I prefer to change the default behavior of the block list property. I'll quickly show you how to do that. And instead, we're going to call a controller, create a view model, and pass that down into our view instead. Right, so we're back inside Visual Studio. And what you should notice is that when you install Umbraco by default, if you look within views, partials, block list, you should see that we've got this default CS HTML file right here. Now, if I open this file, you'll see that the code in order to call the view can be found here on line 14. So you can see here that we're just doing a partial async. We're then looking in at block list components. We're passing in that alias and passing in the block type. Right, so I've switched this over to our refactored view here. And basically the only change we made was line 14, this line here. Now, instead of calling a partial async, instead we're calling a view component. So what we need to do in order to make this change yourself is change this single line to an await component invoke async. And the first parameter we're passing into invoke async is still the document type alias or the block alias, which you get from data content type.alias. And the second property you pass in is the actual content item itself. You can get that from data, and then you can just parse it as an iPublished element. Now, this small change might look small, but it is very mighty, and it's going to lead to much better code. Because what's going to happen now is that when the rendering engine runs, instead of just calling a view, instead it's going to treat the request as a view component, and it's going to automatically try and find a controller for the block based on its alias. Then when that controller gets called, we're going to get access to our Umbraco object. And then within that code, within that action, we can then create a view model and then pass the view model down into our view, creating a much cleaner architecture. Our first task is to create this view component controller. So opening up Solution Explorer, you can see I've created a folder called View Components, and in it I've created a class which is called a block view component. So if I open this, the first thing you'll notice is I inherit from view component. Now the name of my view component here has to start with the Umbraco document type alias. Now remember, in Umbraco, our document types always start with a lowercase. And this is the reason why this is a lowercase b here. Because if I put a capital B, then the routing isn't going to work and you're going to get a page not found error instead. Now obviously you could go back into your default and you could do a bit of code to make sure that the first letter of this alias is uppercase, but I'm going to leave that out for now. Now next, you can see that I'm doing some dependency injection here. Now you'll probably want to access your Umbraco models builder object, and this is the reason why we need to pass in the iPublished value fallback. Now within our action, we just do an async task, iView component result, invoke async, and then we're passing in our iPublished element model. Remember, this is related to this model we're passing in here. Now, in the code itself, I'm free to now create my strongly typed model that's been generated from Umbraco Model Builder. And we do that by picking that class. We need to pass in the model that we're passing in here. And then as a second parameter, we need to pass in this iPublished value fallback. So remember, this is the reason why I injected it here. Now we're in our action, you're free to add in any custom code that you want, so you can make sure that everything's unit testable. And then, as a very basic example, we can see that I've created a very vanilla my view model here, and I'm passing it down back into the HTML. Now, the way that view components work is that if I go back to this folder, you'll see that in my views, I've got another folder which I've called components. Now, within components, I've created a folder called block. So this name here basically needs to map to this, the beginning of our view component name. And then within a block, we're always going to be looking for default.cshtml. So you'll have to create these folders and files yourself. And then within here, you can see I now use model, and I'm binding this to my actual view model, and I can access my data just using model.property name. And then if I look on my website, when I refresh the page, so it's called blocks, you'll see that my property is now being rendered as expected. Now, even though this was a pretty basic example, I'm hoping you can see the bigger picture here, that making that very small tweak and then using controllers with view components is going to give you a much better and cleaner architecture compared to having to write custom code within your views. And if you want to use the block list editor, this is the approach that I personally use, and it's one that I recommend you use as well. The properties that we've looked at so far have been really useful for allowing editors to add blocks and rearrange them on a page. However, one thing that the two previous examples didn't take into consideration is the grid around the actual blocks themselves. Now, what happens if you want to model a solution where editors can actually define the grid layout as well as add blocks? And this is where the block grid property comes into play. So I've jumped us back inside Umbraco. We're on my blocks example page, and if I click on add property, let's select an editor, and if I go down here, you can see that in rich content we've got the block grid, and clicking on this will allow us to create a new grid. So I'm just going to call it grid. Now, when it comes to the grid, you can see that you can install some sample configuration. So this is going to add in some different blocks and some different rows for you. So we've got like a rich text, we've got a 2-column layout. Then we can add in different things like, again, the min and max amount of blocks we can add, live editing mode, we've got the editor width, the number of columns in our grid, the style sheet layout, we've got a create button label, and once we're all happy, we can click on submit. So now that I've created a basic grid, let's look at how we can use our good old friend, the block here. So if I go to the edit settings, you'll see that in configuration, I can click on add block. And if I click on this, again, we're going to get that picker, and anything we've set as an element type within Umbraco, we can pick here. So I'm going to click on block. Now you can see I've got the same label, content model, all that kind of good stuff. I can click submit and click save. So the next thing we can do is if I submit this, if I go back to my page, you can see here that I can now add it onto my grid. So let's create a block. I'm going to call this again my grid content. Click on create, click on publish. Now, if I view my page, you can see that after I refresh the page, we've now got an error, could not render component of type block, because we need to create something within block grid components block. So in order to render this out, if we go back to my page HTML, underneath my get block list HTML, you can see that I'm rendering out the grid property itself by doing get block grid HTML. Now the next step is to create another view component, except for this time we're going to create it within block grid components, and in here we're going to have to create something called block. Now, one thing I should point out here is that if we look in this file here called items, in the bottom we've got on line 23 a call to render out our blocks using HTML.partialAsync. Now, I don't want to keep labouring on about the same point about my massive dislike about being forced to have to write custom code in my views, but if I were to use this property, I would again swap this call out to use a view component call instead. And one of the benefits of doing this is it means that you can reuse your HTML from the block grid and the block list property, and you don't have to duplicate that HTML in two locations. So before I quickly show you how to swap this for a view component, let's look at what the view would look like if you were using this grid component out the box. So within my solution folder, you can see I've created this block CSHTML. Remember, this is based on your Umbraco document type alias. So the underlining model you need to use in this example is an inherits, and then we're still using our view page. But the difference here is that we're doing the block grid item. This takes generics. And you can see here that I'm passing in my Umbraco model builder model, which is called block. Doing that's going to give me strongly typed goodness. I can do my model, content, my content. And then if I go back to my page, I've got rid of my error now, and you can see that I'm rendering out my CMS content. So that covered the default way of working, and now let's change our code to call a view component instead. So this is just basically a one-line change. So on line 23, we just need to swap out the call to partial to this await component invoke async. Now, this is going to take two parameters. The first one is the alias. So we get access to the alias this way by doing item content type dot alias. And the second thing we need to pass in is the content item itself. And we get access to this with item.content. Now, all I need to do is refresh my page here. You'll see that now my view component controller is being called. So all my custom code in here is going to get called. And then now we're going to call the HTML view. So remember, that is this HTML right here. So that covered how to create and render a block inside of the block grid editor. The final thing, which is probably worth pointing out about this property, is how do you customize it? So again, if you go into views, partials, block grid, in here, you're going to see that we've got these 4 different HTML files. So we've covered the items.cshtml and how to override it for the view component. But if you look in default CSHTML, you'll see that the component that defines the overall grid is here. So you can see here that we're passing in the different grid columns. We're setting it to 12. We're setting it to 12 here. Now, if we look within areas, you can see that there's also some CSS around the block grid. And then if we look within area CSHTML, again, you can see there's a bunch of stuff around how to render out the different rows. So that covers the 3 out-of-the-box block-based solutions that you can use with Umbraco v13. Now, personally, in my own content modeling, I will always go for the block list property. Now, I think the block grid is a great idea. However, I think the added complexity of allowing people to add in different rows and columns basically just makes it a bit of a faff. Also, trying to add in your own custom HTML into the different default views is a bit of a pain. Now, remember, when I use the block list, I always use view components, and I recommend you do the same. The second content modeling tip I'll give here as well is that when you're using the block list editor, I always recommend that you create yourself a rich text block. Now, this block is dead simple. You can see it's just set as an element type. It has a single property, and this single property is a rich text editor. But adding this will allow editors to create content and then blocks, and basically have a lot of flexibility about how they design their pages. So I guess to summarize this, I think personally Umbraco is pretty good for allowing you to model blocks within the CMS itself. As you've seen, block building is still continually being improved with all these new stuff in v13. Now personally, you know how I like to model things now. I prefer to use the block list editor with view components, but again, do what makes you happy. Now, I guess we've got to the bit where the final bit to say is that if you're interested in learning more about Umbraco, then I've created a book which is called Umbraco.NET Core Mastery. It's available on LeanPub. It's only about $15, so it's worth checking out if you want a deep dive into how to create websites with Umbraco. On top of that, if you have got value from this video and you have enjoyed it, don't forget to show me some love by clicking on like, because I'd appreciate it. And if you haven't already, and don't be a numbnuts, smash on the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with my weekly content. And my final parting gift to you is that if you're interested in learning more about what's included in Umbraco 13, then on the screen right now, there should be a link to my Umbraco 13 feature tour video. So check on that because it's a banger. Otherwise, until next Sunday, happy coding.